In the history of the Oscars, only Bob Hope and Billy Crystal have emceed more often than the legendary Johnny Carson.
He was the king of late-night TV, but a new tell-all book claims there was a dark side to Johnny Carson.
The legendary Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was a big deal. One appearance could make or break a career.
I suddenly became Carson's rival, which was stupid. I was going on Fox. Fox had 5 stations in those days.
But one guest made a simple choice that got her banned for life. She was already famous, but she crossed a line that upset Carson, who was known for being both private and powerful. The punishment was swift, and she was never invited back. So what exactly did she do? And what does it reveal about the control Carson had over the show? Join us as we uncover the story of the guest who was never allowed to return, the man behind the legendary Tonight Show. You might think Johnny Carson was always the king of late night, that he walked into fame with a smile and a slick suit, already holding the power to make or break anyone who stepped on his stage. But that's not how it all began. Before there was a spotlight, before the laughter and the cameras, there was just a boy from a small town in Iowa who loved magic. And long before anyone was banned from The Tonight Show, Johnny himself was just trying to find his way. He didn't start off as the sharp, witty legend we remember today. He had to earn every bit of that stage, and it took time, discipline, and a spark that began in the most unexpected places. So before we talk about the woman who was never invited back, let's rewind the tape and find out how Johnny Carson became the kind of man who could make that decision in the first place. Here's the most interesting part. Johnny William Carson was born on October 23, 1925, in Corning, Iowa. His father, Homer Lloyd Kit Carson, managed a power company, while his mother, Ruth Elizabeth, was the kind of woman who paid attention to her children's talents. Johnny was the second of 3 kids. He had an older sister and a younger brother named Dick, who one day became a director in television too. At first, nothing about his childhood screamed future icon. The Carsons moved around a bit in Iowa, settling in towns like Avoca, Clarinda, and Red Oak, before finally making Norfolk, Nebraska their home when Johnny was 8. And it was in that quiet town that something unusual happened. Something small, but life-changing. At the age of 12, Johnny stumbled across a book on magic at a friend's house. Unlike most kids who would flip through it and forget it, Johnny did not. That book lit something in him. He didn't just want to read about magic, he wanted to do it. So he saved up money and bought himself a magician's kit through mail order. From that moment on, he was hooked. He would follow his family members around the house, grinning and saying, "Pick a card, any card." His mom, noticing his enthusiasm, made him a cape. It was nothing fancy, but it made him feel like a performer. At 14, he got his first real gig performing for the local Kiwanis Club. He called himself the Great Carsoni, and for each performance, he was paid $3.
All right, there goes card number 1 already. Mike, would you hold it? There's number 1. All right, now watch carefully. There's card number 2.
That may not sound like much, but for Johnny, it was a fortune and a taste of something bigger. By the time he graduated from high school, Johnny already knew he wanted more than what his small town could offer. He packed a bag and hitchhiked to Hollywood, hoping to get closer to the world of entertainment. But Hollywood wasn't waiting with open arms. One early story, partially true and partially a legend, says he was arrested and fined $50 for pretending to be a Navy midshipman. It was a stunt, sure, but maybe it also showed how badly he wanted to belong in a world bigger than his own. However, something changed in him the day he made a grumpy Navy official crack a smile. At the age of 18, Johnny joined the U.S. Navy. It was June 1943, right in the thick of World War II. He trained at Columbia University and Millsaps College, then served aboard the USS Pennsylvania as a communications officer. His job was to decode encrypted messages. But Johnny wasn't only reading codes, he was also boxing in amateur matches. He had a record of 15 wins, no losses, and 1 draw, all while serving at sea. Yet the most memorable moment from his military days wasn't in the boxing ring or behind a code machine. It happened when he met the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal. Forrestal asked Johnny what he planned to do after the war, and Johnny replied honestly. He wanted to become a magician. Forrestal, perhaps amused, asked for a trick. Johnny didn't hesitate. He pulled out a card trick, and for a moment the powerful Navy secretary was just another wide-eyed audience member. That moment told Johnny something important. If he could entertain someone like that, then maybe he really had something. And when the war ended, he didn't waste time figuring out what came next. Johnny used the Navy's education benefits to enroll at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. At first, he planned to become a comedy writer, so he majored in journalism. But writing behind the scenes didn't satisfy him for long. So he switched to speech and drama because he wanted to perform. He wanted to use his voice, to be heard. He also joined the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity and kept doing magic shows for money. At this point, he was earning $25 a performance. That was a big step up from the $3 gigs of his teenage years, and it showed that he was growing, not just in skill, but in confidence too. For his senior thesis, Johnny didn't write a long essay. Instead, he created a radio-style project titled How to Write Comedy for Radio. It was a mix of taped skits and joke breakdowns with Johnny explaining why certain lines worked and others didn't. He wanted to understand the science of laughter, and that understanding would become the foundation of his career. By 1949, Johnny graduated with a degree in radio and speech and a minor in physics. That mix may sound odd, but it explained his deep love for performance and precision. He wasn't only trying to be funny, he wanted to master the timing, the rhythm, the spark that made people laugh without even knowing why. And that's when the door to broadcasting opened. Stay tuned as we delve more into this. The man with the mic. After graduation, Johnny landed a job at a radio station in Lincoln, Nebraska. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. He was on the air, and that was what mattered. Soon after, he got another radio job in Omaha, where he sharpened his delivery and learned how to carry a show. By 1951, he made a major leap. He moved to Los Angeles and took a job as a television announcer. This move changed everything. Television was still new, still figuring itself out. But Johnny saw where it was headed. He wasn't just an announcer, he was watching, learning, and planning his next move. The boy who once said pick a card was now stepping into living rooms across America, with voice first and face soon to follow. And little did anyone know that this quiet announcer was preparing to change television forever. In 1950, Johnny began his formal broadcasting career at WOWAM and WOWTV in Omaha.
In 1949, WOW, as was his first known, flipped on the switch and we became the first television station on the air in Nebraska or Iowa.
His job was far from glamorous as he wasn't hosting anything major yet. But behind the scenes, he was becoming a student of entertainment. He understood that being on air wasn't just about speaking, it was about connecting. So he created a local morning television program called The Squirrel's Nest, and this wasn't any average breakfast show. One of his recurring bits involved interviewing pigeons on the roof of the local courthouse. These weren't real interviews, of course. Johnny would give each pigeon a name and a voice, pretending they were whistleblowers revealing political corruption. It was goofy, satirical, and clever. People started tuning in, not for the news, but for the birds. Even though his show had a shoestring budget, it gave him something he couldn't get anywhere else: freedom to experiment. He was learning how to craft characters, stretch a joke, and read an audience. These were skills he carried with him all the way to The Tonight Show. But at this stage, he still needed to pay the bills. So, to make extra money, Johnny served as a master of ceremonies at church dinners and community fundraisers. Ironically, these were often attended by the same local politicians he mocked on his pigeon bit. He'd shake hands with the mayor at a Sunday chicken dinner, then voice a sarcastic pigeon named Clancy, roasting that same mayor on air. Monday morning, but Johnny made it work. His charm, timing, and gentle delivery softened the sting of his satire. However, what happened next was the kind of break that sounds like fiction. One of the political figures Johnny gently poked fun at had a wife who owned stock in a radio station in Los Angeles. She saw something in Johnny, not just a local talent, but a rising star. She referred him to her brother, who was deeply connected in the growing Southern California television scene. That single referral changed the course of Johnny's life. In 1951, Carson joined KNXT, a CBS-owned television station in Los Angeles, now known as KCBS-TV. And once he hit LA, his creative freedom expanded. He started working on a sketch comedy show called Carson's Cellar. It ran from 1951 to 1953 and became a local cult favorite. The budget was minimal, the production simple, but the humor, pure Johnny. It was quirky, dry, and unpredictable. One of the viewers who couldn't get enough of Johnny's local show was none other than Red Skelton, a big name in comedy at that time. Skelton saw what Johnny could do with just a few props and a tiny studio, and he liked it. In 1953, Skelton invited Carson to join his own nationally broadcast show as a writer. It was a major upgrade. And then fate stepped in again. In 1954, during a rehearsal, Red Skelton accidentally literally knocked himself out. He hit his head just an hour before his live show was scheduled to begin. In a moment of panic, someone needed to step in. Johnny volunteered. He put on his best suit, stood under the hot studio lights, and filled in for Red Skelton live on air. He didn't flinch. He delivered jokes, sketches, and improvised moments that left the audience smiling. When the broadcast ended, people in the industry took notice. That one night, substitution proved Johnny could handle pressure, timing, and a national audience. He wasn't just a writer or a quirky side act. He was a performer. Not long after, another icon took notice. Jack Benny invited Johnny to appear on his program during the opening and closing segments.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, to get on with the show, it gives me great pleasure to present a young fellow who is doing a marvelous job on his own Tonight Show in New York City, Mr. Johnny Carson.
Johnny, with his usual self-deprecating humor, mimicked Benny's mannerisms and teased that Benny had copied him. Instead of taking offense, Benny laughed and predicted that Johnny was headed for something big. Johnny always credited Benny as a huge influence on his timing and delivery, and now he had Benny's blessing. Still, not everything was a straight shot to success. In 1955, Johnny launched The Johnny Carson Show, a variety program backed by a network budget. Expectations were high, but the show struggled to find an audience. It was canceled after one season. Some might have taken that as a sign to quit or pivot, but Johnny didn't see it that way. He saw it as another lesson in what worked, what didn't, and how to adapt. Through the rest of the 50s, Carson kept working. He hosted Earn Your Vacation, a game show in 1954, and made appearances as a guest panelist on shows like To Tell the Truth. From 1961 to 1962, he became a regular on that show. Bit by bit, he was becoming a household face, even if the spotlight hadn't fully landed on him yet. Then a job offer that changed his entire career. In 1957, Carson moved to New York City to host a daytime game show called Who Do You Trust? It aired on ABC, and while Johnny wasn't thrilled about moving to daytime television, he accepted the job. At first, he thought it might hurt his chances of ever being taken seriously in late night again. but it turned out to be the perfect platform. This show gave him two very important things. First, it gave him the chance to ad-lib. Unlike tightly scripted shows, Who Do You Trust? Let Johnny talk directly to contestants. He could be himself, witty, spontaneous, and sharp. The show quickly became a daytime hit, and for 6 years, it was considered one of the best things on television in its time slot. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the show introduced him to Ed McMahon. Ed was brought on as the announcer. He quickly became Johnny's on-screen partner, and they clicked instantly. Ed had the deep voice, the big laugh, and the perfect sense of timing to play the straight man to Johnny's punchlines. Together, they developed a rhythm that later became one of the most iconic duos in television history. And by the early 1960s, Carson had built a reputation as a man who could carry a show, interview guests, land jokes, and keep audiences coming back day after day. He had worked in radio, survived the military, performed magic, written comedy, and now hosted successful daytime television. And though he didn't know it yet, the biggest stage in television was just around the corner. But even as the spotlight drew nearer, Johnny never lost that sense of humility. He once wrote a parody piece for The New Yorker in the year 2000, long after he had retired, poking fun at fellow comedian-turned-commentator Dennis Miller. The piece, titled Proverbs of Dennis Miller, showed that even in his later years, Johnny still had that sharp wit and love for satirical humor. He had come a long way from magic tricks in Norfolk, Nebraska. But the curtain hadn't fully risen yet, because everything he had done, from the pigeons on the courthouse roof to filling in for Red Skelton, was just rehearsal. The main act was still to come. And when Johnny Carson finally took over The Tonight Show, the world didn't just get a host, it got a legend. Here's the most astonishing part. Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show. By the early 1970s, Johnny Carson had firmly planted himself as the undisputed king of late-night television. He had turned The Tonight Show into a national tradition, and for millions of Americans, it had become more than just a talk show. It was a nightly ritual. But in May 1972, Johnny made a move that took the show and his legend even higher. He relocated the entire production from 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York to the NBC studios in Burbank, California. It wasn't a random decision. He wanted to be closer to the heart of celebrity culture, where actors, comedians, and musicians lived just a short drive away. Burbank made it easier for stars to drop by the studio, and soon the show's energy began to reflect that West Coast vibe that was more laid back, a little flashier, and always packed with famous faces. But even as Carson settled into his California routine, he began making changes to lighten his own workload. Starting in 1980, Johnny stopped hosting the show 5 nights a week. Mondays were now handled by guest hosts, while Johnny stuck to the remaining 4 nights. He wasn't getting lazy, he was simply managing his time. When a man becomes the most important face on television, every night off becomes more valuable. Taping schedules also changed. The show was recorded at 5:30 p.m. in Burbank, and then distributed through satellite feeds and cross-country lines to be aired at 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and later again for the Pacific audience. However, in 1979, Carson shocked the media when he announced his plan to retire after 17 years. NBC panicked. The network knew what was at stake. His show was generating around 17% of their pre-tax profits. That's nearly 1/5 of their money riding on one man. So, NBC made a deal. They offered Carson a new 3-year contract that allowed him to cut the show from 90 minutes to 60 and reduced his on-air nights to just 3 a week. In his place, the network brought in more guest hosts. Joan Rivers became the official guest host in 1983. But even that didn't last forever. By 1986, Joan was out, and guest spots were filled by a rotating crew of comics: George Carlin, Gary Shandling, and most notably, Jay Leno. Leno quickly became a regular and eventually secured the Monday night spot. Tuesday nights were reserved for reruns, often labeled the best of Carson. While Carson may have appeared on fewer nights, his paycheck continued to rise, and by the mid-1970s he was making around $4 million a year, equivalent to nearly $20 million today. And that didn't even include the side money he made from nightclub appearances and personal ventures. Hollywood kept calling. Carson received offers to act in major films, including The Thomas Crown Affair and Blazing Saddles. But Johnny always turned them down. When Martin Scorsese wanted him to star alongside Robert De Niro in The King of Comedy, Carson passed. The role went to Jerry Lewis. Johnny knew his lane, and he stayed in it. However, in 1987, Carson's impact was officially recognized. For his 25th anniversary, he received a personal Peabody Award. The board called him an American institution and the most widely quoted American. It was a rare honor, and no one questioned whether he deserved it. Also, there were moments when Johnny showed just how much influence he truly had. In 1973, he joked about a supposed toilet paper shortage.
Of all the shortages we had, there's a gasoline shortage. You know what else is disappearing from the supermarket shelves? Toilet paper.
It was just a throwaway line, but the country took it seriously. People rushed to stores, wiped the shelves clean, and caused an actual toilet paper shortage that lasted for weeks. Carson later apologized, but the incident became a classic example of how powerful words from a trusted voice could send people into a frenzy. Carson was also responsible for one of the most memorable TV debunkings ever aired. When self-proclaimed psychic Uri Geller appeared on the show in 1973, Carson, who had once been a magician himself, was skeptical. He invited famed skeptic James Randi to ensure there would be no trickery. Geller was given props he hadn't prepared for, and on live TV, he froze. "I don't feel strong," he said, visibly shaken. It was a rare moment when late-night comedy turned into investigative television. Even behind the scenes, Carson was at the center of a quiet controversy. While the show was taped in Burbank, editing was still done in New York. NBC used satellites to send the raw footage across the country. These feeds were uncensored and uncut, continuing through commercial breaks. Eventually, private satellite dish owners began intercepting these feeds and documenting what they saw: off-the-cuff comments, swear words, and moments that were not meant for airing. However, Carson wasn't amused when he saw it. But he pressured NBC to stop using satellite feeds. They eventually switched to microwave transmissions until editing was moved to Burbank. But the part of Johnny's story that often goes overlooked is his quiet intolerance for disloyalty. When Joan Rivers accepted a deal with Fox to host her own late-night show and didn't inform Carson directly, he felt deeply betrayed. He never spoke to her again. Rivers tried apologizing, even after the show was canceled, but Johnny refused to take her calls. As a result, she was banned from The Tonight Show for decades. Even after Johnny's retirement, Jay Leno honored the ban. Rivers didn't return until Jimmy Fallon became host. Her story became a cautionary tale in the world of late-night TV. If you crossed Johnny Carson, your career could suffer. And yes, Carson was careful with his image. He sued a portable toilet company for trying to use the name "Here's Johnny." And he won that case, too. Furthermore, Johnny wasn't just a host. He was a gatekeeper, a kingmaker, and a cultural force. He created inside jokes that became national punchlines, characters that lived on long after their sketches ended, and routines that inspired generations of comedians. One of his favorites involved a dramatic toast with a guest. They'd both raise their glasses, shout, "The king is dead," then follow with, "Long live the king." They'd drink, and Ed McMahon would scream from offstage, "The king lives," prompting a perfectly timed spit take. It was silly, but it was Johnny, always in control, always delivering. However, when he finally left The Tonight Show in 1992, millions tuned in for his farewell. There were no wild stunts or tearful goodbyes, just Carson in his chair saying thank you. He left the stage with quiet dignity, just like he had lived off-screen. And when Johnny Carson passed away in 2005, the world mourned more than a man. It mourned an era. Because even now, after decades, whenever people talk about The Tonight Show, one name always rises to the top: Johnny Carson. The biggest legend the show ever had, and the one no one's ever truly replaced. So, what do you think made Johnny Carson so unforgettable, even after all these years? And if you could bring back one moment from Carson's Tonight Show, what would it be? Drop it in the comments section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.